Normandy, France, July 1944. The rain hasn't stopped for 3 days. The fields are soft, soaked, cratered by artillery and tracked by tanks that drag the mud like chains. In the dim gray of dawn, engines growl where there should only be silence. American engineers, helmets low, eyes hollow from days without sleep, move with the urgency of men who know the front is breathing down their necks. From the air, it looks absurd. German reconnaissance pilots glance down through broken clouds and report the impossible. A flat silver scar stretching across the French countryside. It wasn't there yesterday. Today, it gleams. An airstrip. Below, bulldozers roar beside trucks unloading crates of metal mats. Men hammer, weld, and drag lengths of pierced steel planking into place, fitting them like puzzle pieces over raw mud. The rain cannot stop them. The Luftwaffe can't reach them. By nightfall, landing lights flicker through the mist. A P-47 Thunderbolt circles, lowers its gear, and touches down on a runway that didn't exist 48 hours ago. German command will call it madness. The Americans will call it Tuesday. But behind that strip of steel lies one of the most underestimated engineering miracles of World War II. Europe. Summer 1944. After the storm of D-Day subsided, the Allies faced a new and quieter enemy: distance. By early July 1944, the beaches of Normandy were secure, but every mile gained inland stretched the lifeline of the invasion farther from its beating heart. Air power. From the first hours of Operation Overlord, the Allied command knew their success hinged not just on infantry and tanks, but on the constant presence of fighters and bombers overhead. The P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and Typhoons had ruled the skies during the landings, flying from long, safe airfields in southern England. But those airfields now lay hundreds of miles behind a rapidly moving front. Pilots were burning precious fuel just to reach the fight, and often had to turn home after a single strafing run. General Eisenhower's staff saw it unfolding on their maps. The ground troops were advancing faster than the air support could follow. Every kilometer gained inland meant less coverage, slower response times, and higher losses from German ambushes and counterattacks. Without the aircraft, the Allies would lose their most decisive weapon. To close that widening gap, engineers had to bring the sky forward. That was the birth of the Advanced Landing Grounds, or ALGs, temporary combat airfields designed to appear almost overnight, right behind the leading edge of battle. The responsibility fell to an elite, largely unseen corps, the 9th Engineer Command of the U.S. Army Air Forces, nearly 40,000 men divided into battalions of specialists, surveyors, bulldozer operators, welders, electricians, fuel handlers. Their mission: to carve a piece of sky wherever the infantry paused long enough to breathe. Every operation was a race. A site would be selected just days after its liberation: a meadow, a farm, a stretch of highway. And engineers would move in before the smoke had cleared. Mines and booby traps were the first obstacles. German artillery sometimes the second. They worked under fire, often using captured enemy bulldozers and trucks, cutting, grading, and laying steel matting by hand. Speed became a doctrine. The 9th Engineer Command refined its rhythm until it resembled an industrial assembly line spread across a continent. Bulldozers first, graders next, surveyors marking with white tape, crews unrolling miles of steel mesh. Each ALG was numbered and codenamed A1, A2, A3, and could host fighters within days. To the outside observer, it looked chaotic, but it was orchestration at its finest. Every truckload of steel matting and fuel drum was pre-scheduled by Eisenhower's Logistics Command. Even the British Royal Engineers adopted the American system, impressed by its precision. Still, the Germans refused to believe the reports. Their own Luftwaffe operated from vast permanent bases with concrete runways and solid hangars, airfields that took months to construct. They assumed no army could build an operational airfield in less than a week, let alone 2 days. But the American philosophy was different. Good enough today, one officer said, is better than perfect tomorrow. By mid-July 1944, Allied engineers were proving him right. Each new airstrip shortened the lifeline between the sky and the ground, letting Thunderbolts and Mustangs refuel just behind the front. Pilots no longer had to cross the channel. They could launch, strike, land, and be back in the air within an hour. For the Allies, it was momentum turned into infrastructure. For the Germans, it was a sign of a war, machine that refused to slow down. And soon, on a rain-drenched field outside Normandy, that momentum would culminate in a feat one in Berlin believed possible. The landscapes of northern France were never meant for flight. Soft soil, hedgerows, narrow farm roads, and unpredictable weather made every construction site a battle in itself. Yet the Allies needed to move their air power forward. Not slowly, not cautiously, but in rhythm with an army advancing through mud and fire. By late July 1944, the front lines stretched beyond Saint-Lô and Carentan. The U.S. First Army under Omar Bradley had broken through the Bocage country, pushing toward Avranches in Operation Cobra. Tanks rolled, infantry pressed forward. But the air war needed to keep up. Behind them, the 9th Engineer Command received urgent orders. Each time a town fell, the engineers followed within hours, marking potential landing grounds with white flags. They carried little more than bulldozers, graders, and crates of pierced steel planking, PSP, the revolutionary material that turned the impossible into routine. PSP was nothing more than steel sheets punched with rows of holes, each plate weighing about 66 pounds and measuring 10 feet long. When interlocked, they created a surface strong enough for fighters to land on soft, rain-soaked ground. To the Germans, it was inconceivable. They still relied on concrete. To the Americans, it was freedom. Convoys of trucks from Cherbourg and the beachheads brought thousands of these steel mats, often driving through terrain still scattered with mines. The supply lines were relentless. Fuel, ammunition, food, and now entire airfields in pieces, ready to be assembled. German intelligence officers noticed strange movements. Through radio intercepts and reconnaissance photos, they saw flat clearings appearing near the front, but they dismissed them as staging areas or vehicle depots. One Luftwaffe officer reportedly remarked, "The Americans are too lazy for engineering. That arrogance would cost them." The Allies' tempo of construction was staggering. Between June and August 1944, U.S. and British engineers built over 120 new airfields across France and Belgium. Some took a week. Some, like the one that stunned German command, took less than 48 hours from first shovel to first landing. Every site was a symphony of logistics. Bulldozers cleared the fields. Graders leveled the terrain. Crews unrolled rolls of steel mesh or nailed together wooden planks where supplies ran thin. Fuel farms were dug by hand, drums buried in the earth to protect them from shrapnel. Communication lines stretched out across muddy ditches. Rain was constant. The roar of artillery in the distance never stopped. Yet morale stayed high. The engineers knew what they were doing mattered more than medals. Every finished strip meant more sorties, more protection for the infantry, and fewer German tanks alive the next morning. Their speed was born of necessity and discipline. The 9th Engineer Command trained relentlessly in England before D-Day, rehearsing the full process like a factory drill. Survey, clear, grade, mat, mark, light, and fuel. When war came, they executed it like muscle memory. But to the German generals, the reports defied logic. Intelligence from Normandy described entire fighter squadrons operating from airfields that hadn't existed 3 days earlier. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photos showed the glint of PSP runways cutting through farmland, proof that Allied logistics were far beyond anything they had imagined. Field Marshal von Kluge, overseeing the Western Front in mid-1944, refused to believe his staff. "No airfield can be built that quickly," he said. "They are misreading the images." He was wrong. By early August, the Allies were laying down their most ambitious target yet, an operational airstrip built within 2 days, directly supporting the drive toward the Seine. The order came, the engineers mobilized, and the Germans would soon watch in disbelief as the lazy Americans did the impossible. Again, and in that moment, in a churned-up field between war and weather, ingenuity would prove just as decisive as firepower. 1. The human angle. The men who built the sky, they called themselves the Dirt Engineers. They were young, many barely out of high school, drafted from farms, workshops, and factories across America. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. Most had never fired a rifle in anger. Their weapon was the bulldozer. Their front line was mud. When the infantry took a village, the engineers arrived before the smoke cleared. Sometimes the Germans were still within artillery range. The men dug, measured, and worked without cover. "We were building faster than the enemy could shell," one veteran of the 9th Engineer Command recalled. There were no medals for speed. No headlines, but each airfield meant lives saved, missions launched, and the relentless pulse of progress. They slept in the open, ate cold rations, and often built under the light of flares. When the rain turned fields into quagmires, they used their own trucks to compact the mud. If equipment broke, they fixed it with spare wire and willpower. It was, in every sense, a human triumph of endurance. These men weren't chasing glory. They were buying time. And time, in Normandy, was everything. The technological angle. Pierced steel planking. The miracle metal before the war. No one had imagined airfields could be temporary. Aircraft needed concrete, or so everyone believed. But by 1942, American engineers had invented a new concept: mobility through modularity. Pierced steel planking, PSP, was born out of necessity. Each sheet was stamped with rows of holes that made it lighter and allowed mud to drain. The interlocking design meant 2 men could lay it down and lock it into place within seconds. A mile-long runway could be built in a single day if the ground was ready. The PSP was tough enough for fighters like the P-47 and P-51, yet flexible enough to survive artillery shockwaves and tank crossings. In storage, it could be stacked like lumber and moved by truck or ship. Once the front advanced, crews would dismantle entire runways, load them up, and rebuild them further east, sometimes reusing the same steel multiple times. This modular ingenuity symbolized the American approach to warfare. Industrial efficiency turned into battlefield agility. While the Germans poured resources into fixed fortifications, the Atlantic Wall, massive hangars, and concrete bases, the Americans treated infrastructure as fluid. An airfield wasn't a place anymore. It was a process. The PSP became an icon of Allied innovation, a tool that could turn any meadow into an operational base overnight. To the Luftwaffe, it seemed like magic. To the 9th Engineer Command, it was Tuesday. The tactical angle, the new face of air-ground warfare before Normandy, air power was strategic, bombing cities, railways, and factories. But, on the Western Front, the Allies reinvented the role of the fighter. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the Typhoon became flying artillery. They needed to be close to the ground units, ready to strike within minutes. That meant one thing: airfields had to move with the front. The tactical payoff was immense. The 48-hour airfields brought fighter-bomber squadrons within 20 miles of the front lines. Recon aircraft could take off, photograph enemy positions, and deliver film back to headquarters before lunch. Strikes could be ordered, executed, and confirmed within a single afternoon. This seamless coordination shattered the German rhythm. Their armored columns, which once maneuvered freely, were now hunted relentlessly. Every time a panzer battalion regrouped, fighters were overhead. Every bridge rebuilt overnight was bombed before dawn. The Germans tried to adapt, dispersing their aircraft and hiding fuel dumps, but they were fighting a force that no longer needed time to prepare. The Allies could build, fly, and strike almost simultaneously. The 48-hour airfield wasn't just an engineering success. It was a revolution in tempo. It turned air power from a distant hammer into an immediate blade, and it forced the German command to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans weren't just numerous. They were fast. As the engineers built new runways under fire, the Luftwaffe struggled to comprehend how their enemies could create an entire operational base faster than they could relocate one squadron. That disbelief would soon turn to shock when intelligence reports confirmed what no one in Berlin wanted to believe. The lazy Americans had built an airfield from raw mud to first landing in just 48 hours. In the summer of 1944, German command rooms were filled with maps, reports, and disbelief. The Wehrmacht was fighting for its life on the Western Front. After years of dominance, its generals faced something they hadn't encountered before: an opponent who moved faster than logic. German aerial reconnaissance over Normandy kept bringing back the same images. Open fields transformed into operational airstrips. The photos were studied, magnified, questioned. "Impossible," said General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Kluge. It must be deception. But it wasn't deception. By July's end, Allied fighters were taking off from areas the Germans had shelled only days earlier. Airfields like A9, Le Mollet, A10, Carentan, and A12, Lignerolles, sprang up seemingly overnight. Each one pushed Allied air superiority deeper into France, cutting Luftwaffe response times to zero. German field officers sent panicked telegrams to Berlin. One Luftwaffe intelligence report noted, "The Americans appear capable of erecting landing facilities in a matter of hours. Reconnaissance suggests a new engineering technique or prefabricated surface unknown to us." The German command suspected secret materials, concrete polymers, chemical hardeners, even captured French technology. They couldn't grasp that it was simply steel, sweat, and speed. Their disbelief reflected a deeper problem within the Nazi war machine: a rigid, centralized mindset that worshipped perfection and underestimated adaptability. The Germans built monumental weapons, the Tiger tank, the V-2 rocket, but struggled with flexibility. The Americans, by contrast, turned practicality into power. The myth of the lazy American, a propaganda phrase born in the early war years, was shattered in the mud of Normandy. German officers soon realized that what they called laziness was, in truth, an unshakable calm, a quiet confidence that could build airfields faster than the Reich could respond. The leadership angle, Eisenhower's invisible victory, at the highest levels of Allied command. The airfields weren't just tactical assets. They were the arteries of a grand strategy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, understood that the war in Europe would be decided not just by who could fight, but by who could move. "We must carry our air power with us," he told his staff. Weeks before D-Day, his deputy for air operations, Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, and the NIAD's Tactical Air Command developed a radical synchronization plan. As the Army advanced, engineers would follow immediately, building landing grounds so the aircraft could leapfrog forward in perfect sync. It was mobile warfare turned three-dimensional. The results exceeded expectations. Every time Bradley's First Army broke through, fighters and bombers were already waiting overhead, striking targets far beyond German anticipation. The logistical chain, from supply ship to airstrike, worked with industrial precision. Eisenhower's genius wasn't just in commanding vast armies, it was in delegating to men who could think freely. The Nyack's Engineer Command operated almost autonomously, trusted to improvise. In that freedom lay their power. German generals could never have imagined such decentralization. Their engineers waited for orders. The Americans made decisions on the ground. That difference between obedience and initiative defined the pace of victory. By mid-August, as the Falaise pocket closed and German forces crumbled, Eisenhower received reports of new airfields going operational almost daily. Each one shortened his logistical tail and accelerated the fall of France. Behind the maps and operations orders, there was quiet satisfaction. The Allied High Command knew that their true advantage wasn't just manpower or machines, it was the human mind unleashed from bureaucracy. The moral angle, ingenuity as a weapon, there is something profoundly moral about the image of men building, not destroying, in the middle of war. Amid the thunder of artillery and the devastation of Europe, American engineers were creating runways, roads, bridges, lifelines. Each 48-hour airfield symbolized a refusal to be limited by circumstance. Mud, rain, chaos, none of it mattered. They built because they had to, and because they could. The psychological turning point. The German front-line soldiers were the first to feel the change. By the fourth day, P-47 Thunderbolts from the new airstrip were already strafing supply columns on the highways east of St. Lo. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but their own airfields were far behind the lines. They needed hours to scramble and reach the area, and by then the Americans were already airborne again. Captured German officers spoke later of confusion and fatigue. They could no longer predict when or where Allied aircraft would appear. The Americans seemed to rebuild the sky every morning, one said in interrogation. The Luftwaffe's intelligence branch, Luftnachrichtendienst, sent urgent memos suggesting that Allied engineers had developed a chemical soil stabilizer that hardened ground instantly, an attempt to rationalize the irrational. The truth was simpler. Manpower, machinery, and logistics working in perfect concert. That harmony became a psychological weapon. German soldiers, once trained to fight overwhelming numbers, now faced overwhelming speed. Every counterattack they planned was met with airstrikes from bases that shouldn't exist yet. By late July, the myth of Allied overextension was dead. The Americans were no longer outrunning their own logistics. They were dragging it forward with them. And in Berlin, a chilling realization settled over the High Command. The war's tempo had changed. The Reich had entered an industrial war it could not match. A victory of Time Eisenhower's Daily Situation reports noted the success with little fanfare. A short line in the July summary read, A-12 operational within 48 hours of order. Air support now available for Cobra sector. No medals, no speeches. Just another objective met. But for the men who built it, the 48-hour airfield was more than an entry in a report. It was proof that time itself could be conquered. As one engineer wrote in his field diary, "We didn't win by killing faster. We won by building faster." That simple sentence captured the essence of the Allied advance. Every foot of runway laid down shortened the war by seconds. Every second saved meant fewer men lost. And on that strip of steel, shining beneath the French sun, the balance of momentum shifted irreversibly. The Luftwaffe would never regain initiative over France again. Their supply lines, already crippled by fuel shortages, were now strangled by a relentless, mobile enemy. The Germans had built their empire on the promise of permanence. bunkers, walls, and machines of steel. The Americans built their victory on movement. When the P-47s lifted from that field for the first time, the sound of their engines carried far beyond the horizon. Soldiers in the nearby villages stopped and listened, realizing that air support was now at their doorstep. To the men on the ground, it meant survival. To the men in Berlin, it meant defeat, not yet complete, but inevitable. The battlefield had changed forever, and the Germans finally understood what their reports had been telling them for weeks. The Americans were not lazy. They were unstoppable. The sky follows the ground. The days after the 48-hour airfield went operational marked a new rhythm in the Allied campaign. What had been a grinding, rain-soaked push through hedgerows now became a fluid advance. The Americans had learned how to carry their sky with them. As Operation Cobra gathered momentum in late July 1944, hundreds of fighters and fighter-bombers lifted from freshly built strips across Normandy. A-10 Carentan, A-12 Lignerolles, A-15 Maupertus. These weren't bases. They were launch pads for liberation. The concept was working exactly as Eisenhower had envisioned. Each time the infantry and armor broke through, the airfields leapt forward behind them. Within weeks, the Nijmegen Engineer Command had constructed or repaired more than 120 airfields across France and Belgium. Some were grass, others PSP. Some handled small reconnaissance aircraft, others heavy Thunderbolts and Mustangs. The sheer scale stunned even Allied planners. At the heart of this machine was speed. An airfield could be planned in the morning, surveyed by noon, and hosting aircraft by dusk. Engineers dismantled older sites and recycled their steel to build new ones further east. The front and the infrastructure moved together. One continuous surge. This mobility gave Allied forces a decisive edge in responsiveness. P-47s flying from forward bases could reach German columns within minutes of receiving radio calls from frontline observers. The coordination between ground and air became seamless. When tanks called for air cover, it arrived before the dust settled. German logistics, already crippled by fuel shortages and rail bombings, now collapsed completely. Roads once used for resupply turned into death traps. Columns of vehicles were destroyed before they could move. The Luftwaffe, forced to fly from distant bases in the Netherlands or Germany, simply couldn't keep up. Every new airfield added another dagger pointed eastward. The Allies were no longer advancing cautiously. They were surging, and each steel runway became a springboard for the next phase. By mid-August, American air power dominated the sky over the Falaise pocket, annihilating retreating German forces. Pilots landed, rearmed, and were airborne again within hours, thanks to those temporary strips. The German 7th Army was destroyed in open terrain that, only a month earlier, would have been unreachable by Allied aircraft. The human cost and the quiet pride. For the engineers, there were no parades. They were often gone before the first fighter squadron arrived, already en route to the next patch of farmland that needed to become a runway. Their reward was silence, and the knowledge that each finished field saved lives. The price, however, was heavy. Hundreds of engineers were killed or wounded during construction, crushed under vehicles, caught in artillery fire, or hit by strafing runs from desperate Luftwaffe pilots. Yet morale remained unbroken. Letters home spoke not of fear, but of exhaustion and pride. "We work fast," one corporal wrote, "because the boys up front need us to." In post-war interviews, pilots rarely remembered their names, but always remembered their work. "Those airstrips were miracles," one P-47 pilot said. "We'd land on mud and steel that hadn't even cooled yet." The 9th Engineer Command's performance became legendary in military circles. Their motto, "We build the air power that wins," was no exaggeration. By the end of the campaign in France, they had built enough airfields to support over 9,000 aircraft in constant rotation. Each one was a statement of Allied will, not through speeches or propaganda, but through action. And as August 1944 turned to September, the steel mats of Normandy began to fade into the dust of history, their purpose fulfilled. But the idea behind them, that mobility was victory, would shape every modern army to come. The legacy of speed. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the world began to study how the Allies had moved so fast. The war had been won not only by courage or numbers, but by tempo, the ability to turn logistics into motion. The 48-hour airfield became a blueprint for the future. Military analysts from the United States, Britain, and later NATO dissected the 9th Engineer Command's techniques in post-war reports. They found a doctrine that combined industrial efficiency with battlefield adaptability, an entirely new kind of warfare engineering. No longer would airfields be viewed as fixed installations. The war had proven that mobility was survival. From Korea to Vietnam, and later across the Cold War front lines in Europe, the concept of expeditionary air power traced its roots directly to those muddy French fields. American engineers introduced prefabricated mat systems made from aluminum and fiberglass, lighter descendants of the PSP that had baffled the Germans. The U.S. Air Force's Rapid Engineer Deployable Heavy Operational Repair Squadron, known simply as Red Horse, was born from the legacy of the 9th Engineer Command. Their mission echoed the past: build, repair, and restore airfields under combat conditions, anywhere, anytime. Even NATO's Cold War defensive planning incorporated dispersed field operations, small, quickly constructed runways designed to keep aircraft flying after a nuclear strike. The 48-hour miracle of 1944 became the foundation for an entire philosophy of mobility. The German reflection for the defeated Reich: the lesson came too late. Post-war debriefings of captured officers revealed their astonishment. Many admitted that they had never considered mobile airfield operations feasible. Their obsession with precision had blinded them to improvisation. One Luftwaffe colonel, interviewed in 1946, confessed, "We saw the airfields appear and thought it was sorcery. We never imagined such work could be done by men, under fire, without command from above." The German system had prized perfection. The Americans had prized completion. That difference had won the war of movement. The industrial mindset turned human back in the United States. Veterans of the 9th Engineer Command returned to civilian life with little recognition. But the industries they rejoined, construction, aviation, logistics, absorbed their wartime experience. Many became pioneers in civil engineering and infrastructure planning, applying the same principles of modularity and rapid deployment to peacetime projects, highways, airstrips, even early space launch sites. The war had taught them something profound: that speed and structure were not opposites, but allies. The ability to build fast and build right became part of the American identity in the post-war world. The echoes in modern warfare. 70 years later, when U.S. engineers constructed forward air bases in Iraq and Afghanistan in a matter of days, they were following the same lineage. Bulldozers, modular runways, and portable fuel farms, all direct descendants of the Normandy fields. The names and tools had changed, but the spirit had not. Each time an aircraft lifts from a temporary strip in a distant desert, it carries with it the ghost of those men who built under artillery fire in 1944. The men who proved that war could be won not just by destroying, but by creating faster than the enemy could comprehend. By the war's end, the 9th Engineer Command had completed 241 airfields across Europe, each one a story of sweat, mud, and ingenuity. Each one a monument to the idea that victory belongs to those who refuse to wait for conditions to be perfect. And though few remember their names, every pilot who landed safely on steel laid by their hands owed them his life. Their legacy endures in every temporary runway, every expeditionary base, every belief that speed, when guided by purpose, can change the course of history. The war in Europe was fought with bullets and bombs, but it was won with ideas. Among them, none was quieter or more powerful than the belief that what must be done can be done fast. The 48-hour airfield was not a miracle of technology. It was a triumph of will, the pure, determined application of human effort against time itself. In that muddy field in Normandy, the Americans proved that war was no longer about who had the biggest guns or the thickest armor. It was about who could think, move, and build the fastest. That revelation reshaped modern warfare. It taught the world that adaptability was strength, that improvisation could outmatch perfection, and that the front line was no longer fixed to the map, but could shift with every engineer's shovel and every truckload of steel. The Germans had believed in permanence. They built walls, fortresses, and empires of concrete. The Americans believed in motion. They built bridges, roads, and airfields, and through them a new kind of power. When historians look back at 1944, they see the grand offensives, Normandy, Cobra, Falaise. But beneath those victories lies a foundation made not of stone, but of steel, planking, and mud, shaped by hands that never stopped working. Those engineers, anonymous and unsung, carried a quiet lesson for generations to come, that progress belongs to those who refuse to wait for the weather to clear. Their 48-hour runway was more than a path for aircraft. It was a symbol of resolve, ingenuity, and the relentless spirit of a nation that believed the impossible was simply a matter of timing. And when the first thunderbolt rose from that strip of French earth, the sound of its engine carried farther than any bomb. It carried a message that freedom moves forward not in months or years, but in hours.